Hello and welcome everybody to part 2 of my introduction to GameMaker. This is part of my tutorials Make Games with GameMaker. My name is Michael Bateman. The idea of these introduction tutorials are for those who've had absolutely no experience in making games whatsoever and they've decided that they would quite like to make their own game. That's what I tried to do a couple of years ago. And I found that lots of different tutorials helped me along the way, and hopefully these tutorials can feed into that community and help some more people as well. So then, in order to make this tutorial, what we're going to do is borrow some resources from the GameMaker's Apprentice, which is a book that I got a couple of years ago by Jacob Habgood and Mark Overmars. It's very good for learning how to use GameMaker because it has lots of different resources and ways that you can develop some games with the material that they provide. One of the downsides is that it was made quite a few years ago and GameMaker's come on quite a way since then. For those who don't know, obviously it's called GameMaker Studio now, and a lot of things have changed, and so a lot of the way that they write the code in the old books isn't quite correct, and so you have to sort of work around that and find solutions to the problems as you go, which can be quite beneficial because it means that when it comes to making your own games, you sort of already developed a way of trying to come around the problems that come with coding, which can be plentiful. But what we're going to do is borrow some of their resources just to make this beginner game. And what we're going to do then is we're going to create our first sprite. Now, as we spoke about in the first part of the tutorial, part 1, sprites are the images that we need to use to create the objects within our game. So they might be player characters, they might be weapons, they might be sort of platforms or spikes or anything like that. It's all obviously images to start with. So if we look at this and create our very first sprite, the first thing that we've got to do is obviously name this sprite. Now, one of the first lessons that you need to learn when using the software is that you can't have any gaps within your names of your sprites or your objects or your sounds, anything at all really, because when it comes to transposing that into code itself, if you've got any spaces, then it's going to start to separate it into two things and it's going to get confused as to whether it is part of the same bit of script or not. So what we do to get around that is we do little underscores, so it helps to make it a bit more readable. Some people like to use capital letters, but it's not for me because I use capitals for other things, which I'll explain in another tutorial. But basically we use SPR, which is just a shortened version of sprite. So it just allows us to know what the resource is, and this is going to be our player, and our player is going to be a dragon. So we call it sprite dragon or SPR underscore dragon. Now what we then need to do is load the sprite because we already have the resource. This will be the sprite that we're going to be using. So this is going to be 6 little animations. So I'll show you 6 little images, sorry. So as we can see, what happens is we've uploaded this particular sprite and we've got 6 different images. Now what GameMaker does is just play each image after the other in the speed that we tell it to, and then what that does is create the animation here. So all it is almost like if you remember the old flip books where you sort of flip through the pages and it would create an animation. Well, that's what it does with these sprites. It's just flipping all through these in order over and over again, and it looks like the dragon's got some flapping wings. Nice and easy. Now obviously if you haven't got some resources to lean on, there are some already within the GameMaker tutorials that you can use. There's plenty of free sprites and things if you go searching on Google, or alternatively obviously you can create your own sprite by using the tools that are inbuilt within GameMaker. We can do this by just coming into the edit sprite section, clicking new. You can choose the size of the sprite. This width and height is based on the dragon that we've already got, but if we do that, what it does is it comes up with your blank canvas here. And then obviously what you can do is whatever you want to this canvas. So we can edit the image, we could color it, we could do some a box on it or whatever. If you're particularly artistic, I'm sure you can go nuts in here. It's something that I've had to learn along the way when I've been making my first couple of games. And then what we do is we have this image here, and this then becomes our sprite. And obviously we can make multiple images if we want to animate them. And then that's what our sprite would be. But as we said, what we're going to do is we're going to use some made up ones already, which is our dragon here. And all we do is we push OK, and that's it. We've got a sprite. Okay, so we've developed our first sprite, our sprite dragon, which is going to be our main character. But what this is obviously just a collection of pictures or images. So it's not actually going to be able to do anything like a game. So all it is literally just a picture or a couple of pictures, which is no good to us if we want to make a video game. So what we need to do is to create an object so that we can tell that picture what to do. So if we go in and create our first object, now similarly to when we create a sprite, we need to give it a name. Again, we don't want any spaces. It's good to obviously start with a beginning prefix, so we use obj for object, and then we'll just call it object dragon. Now what you've got to be careful of is you can't really avoid doing things like these prefixes of obj or spr, because when you create these and start to play with them within the code section of GameMaker, or if you do the drag and drop options and you ask GameMaker to sort the code out for you, the game needs to be able to differentiate between the different things. So if you were to call the object just dragon, for example, and you were to call the sprite just dragon as well, then when it comes to it, the game or the engine, when it's creating your game, isn't going to know what's an object and what's a sprite, and that's obviously going to cause a lot of problems. So we need to make sure that we differentiate them properly. When you start to come into coding, when you're a little bit further down the line, you're going to need to be able to draw on these resources as you're typing away. So if you start things with obj or spr if it's a sprite, then it's very easy for you to find them within all your different sprites or objects that you might have, rather than perhaps searching around for them if you were calling them. So for example, we decided to call the sprite lowercase dragon and the object uppercase dragon. It might be a little bit more difficult to find. So it's good to keep it nice and consistent, to have a good working pattern that you can work with, so that when you've got 10,000 lines of code in a few months' time, you can very easily find what you're after. So what we do is we give that our sprite. So here's where we select a sprite for our object. Jumping down the road, you don't necessarily have to give an object a sprite, particularly if you're using it for, say, some sort of controller object. It might just sort of be humming around in the background, collecting statistics, or randomly generating other objects or things like that. If you don't give it a sprite, then you can pop it within your game and in the room that you're working in, but it won't actually appear. It will just sort of be hidden behind the scenes, working away. But if we want the player to be able to see our object, then we have to give it an image. In this particular case, we're creating our sprite dragon, which is going to be our main player. So let's have a look at this object section then. You'll become familiar with this quite quickly. There's a few things down here that you can worry about a little bit later on. For when you're making your very first games, obviously we're on day one beginner level now, what we need to be looking at is the events, which is things that obviously are trigger actions to occur. So it might be that when the object is created within the room, we want certain things to happen. It might be that the player clicks on the object or something else, and so we have a mouse event, and that will trigger things to occur. The player might press different keys. The object might collide with another object, in which case we want something to happen. If a bullet hits a spaceship, we might want it to explode and destroy both of them, those sort of things. There's also the step event and the draw event, and I think to a certain extent the alarm event as well. The alarm event's slightly simpler. But these two here actually turn out to be quite key events that you'll be working with quite a lot. But we won't worry about them just yet. because obviously we're just trying to keep it nice and simple for today. So the first thing we want to do is to make our character move around the screen. So what we'll do is we'll use the keyboard, and what we'll do is if the player presses the up key, if it works, we're going to want our character to move upwards. Now you'll see obviously all the different drag and drop options that are along here, and then each of those are split into different tabs as well. So there's lots of different drag and drop options which can allow you to make a very basic game without knowing pretty much any code at all. And that's what we're hopefully going to demonstrate here for our first little game that we're going to make. So we want it to move, so we have different move options here. So we have the move fixed, we have the move freeform. We can make it move towards a particular target, or we can just make it move horizontal or vertical. We can give it some gravity so that it will quicken its pace towards whatever gravitational pull direction you set it. We can make it reverse when the particular parameters happen, horizontal or vertically. And we can also set some friction. So obviously almost to an opposite of gravity really, that'll make it slow down as it goes over a certain distance. And then also we have different things here, but we'll touch those later. First of all, what we're going to want to do is when the player presses up, we're going to want the dragon to move in a fixed direction in an upward direction. So here we have who it applies to, so we're going to want it to apply to this particular object. As we were talking about controllers earlier, if you were to have a controller option and the player was to press the up key, then you might want it to apply to an other object, or if it was a collision, you might want it to apply to the other thing that it collided with. But in this particular example, it's going to apply to itself, and we're going to want it to move in the upwards direction. So we select the up direction there. Now the speed is going to be based on how many pixels per step that the object is going to move. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but if you think of the basics of pixels and how big your screen is, or how big your game screen is going to be, we need to determine how quickly it will move across. So for now we're going to select a speed of 16. We can always come back and change that later if we're not very happy with it, and we'll click OK. So similarly, what we're going to do is if we have a down press of the key as well, we're going to want it to move in a downward direction, and we'll set that to a speed of 16 as well so that it's consistent. Okay, so what we have is our object dragon that can move up the screen and down the screen. When the player presses the keyboard, it will start moving in the direction as we've told it to do. Now, we've already generated our very first bug in the game, but I'm going to leave it in for now just so that we can demonstrate why you have to tell an object absolutely everything that you want it to do, or it just doesn't know. It can't sort of read your mind. You have to tell it all the different instructions. So, but we'll leave that in there for now just so that we can demonstrate that. So if we push OK, what we need to do then is we need to create our first room so that we can have a gaming environment for the player, and we can start to move the object dragon around that room. So if we create a room, bring this in here. Now when you first open up the room, you'll see that this is our game window. So this is what the player will see. And if we take away the grid lines, then that's the blank canvas that will be our game. Now we can dictate the size of that room by changing the width and height here. Now because we're working off of the tutorial example, we will change the room to the sizes that we want them to be for this particular tutorial, which is 640 by 480. So quite a small room that we're going to be working with. Obviously, we want to give our room a name. When we're making games later on, obviously we're going to have multiple rooms. More than likely, so you're going to want to be moving between the different rooms. So again, it needs to have a good name so that we can access it when we start to learn how to do code and things like that. So again, we give it a small prefix, which is rm underscore, and then we'll call this our main room. So we'll just do room main rm underscore main. So we've got our size. Now the speed, I might do this in a separate tutorial if people can't, or if people are struggling to sort of get their head around it. But essentially the speed is how many steps per second that the game occurs in. So it is quite similar to frames per second, and it can help to sort of think of it that way if you already have an understanding of frames per second, but technically it is steps, and the game engine works in steps, so you need to make sure that you understand that. Whatever we change this to, it doesn't really matter as long as we keep it consistent amongst all aspects of the game so that everything keeps working correctly. So remember when I showed the animation of the dragon and the 6 images and its wings flapping, when we demonstrated that, that was at a speed of 30 steps per second. Now if we were to increase that to 60 steps per second, then it would flip through those images twice as quickly and the wings would go absolutely nuts. We can actually quickly demonstrate that just by having a look in here. Let's pull this over so we can have a look. So as you can see, this is a preview of the dragon flipping through the 6 images, and it's at a speed of 30 steps per second. Now if we were to change that to 60, we can see that the wings start to go absolutely bonkers because they're moving at twice the speed. Now you can obviously do that in your game, and you can make your game smoother that way by having obviously 60 steps per second. There's going to be more images being shown to the player, so that it's going to be a smoother looking game for the player, but obviously you're going to have to counteract that by having twice as many images so that it works at the speed that you want it to. So that's that there. So coming back to the room then, as we say, this is our blank canvas of a room, and what we're going to want to do is we're going to put our very first object in it, which is our object dragon. Now, this is the only object we have at the moment. When we've got some more, we'll be able to select from a different list here. But as we've only got a dragon at the moment, that's the only option we've got. So let's pop our dragon into our room. We can move it around as to where we want the starting position to be. We'll have it over here. Now, when the player loads the game, they'll be able to see this, and hopefully we'll then be able to show the dragon moving up and down as we push the different keys. Okay, so we've got everything together as we want it to make our first little run of the game. So we're just going to press and compile the game now. We don't need to run in debug mode, so we'll just go for the basic run the game. And here we are. So just as we spoke about, this is the room that we created. So it looks exactly as the room looked. We have our character here, which is displaying our sprite. It's running through the 6 images to make the wings flap. We've got it at a speed of 30 steps per second, so it's going at a reasonable speed, and obviously it's an object that we've put within our room. So we have our dragon on the screen, and what we want to do now is to start to control the player. So if I push up, the dragon will start to move up, and if I push down, the dragon will start to move down. Now there's 2 obvious problems with the way that this character controls. First of all, I'm only pressing and tapping the up and down keys. I'm not holding them down, but even though I'm only pushing them once, the character will keep on moving. Also, if I just push it and let go, you'll see that the character will go off the screen at the top and the character will go off the screen at the bottom. Neither of these things are particularly good game mechanics. We don't want our character disappearing off of the gaming screen. Obviously, players aren't going to like that. And secondly, if I let go of the up button, I expect it to stop moving up. I don't expect it to keep on going. And similarly with the down key. So these are the 2 little things that we've got to sort out. And as I was saying earlier, it comes down to the fact that you have to tell the object absolutely everything that you want it to do. You can't leave anything and think that the computer will understand that once I finish pushing up it will stop moving up, obviously, or we're never going to want it to go off the screen, so why on earth is it going off the screen? Well, these things can happen and will happen. So we need to tell the computer what to do at all eventualities so that the objects behave the way that we want them to. Okay, so that's enough of me pushing up and down. I'm going to give myself an issue with my fingers. So we'll close that and we'll go back into the object dragon and we'll try and solve the issues that we have. Now the first thing we have is that if no key is being pushed on the keyboard, then we want it to stop moving. So if we move the fixed, again still applying to itself. Now if we select this center button, it means it'll stop moving, and obviously we're going to want a speed of 0, and if we push OK, that should hopefully prevent our dragon from going continuously up and continuously down. So let's test that out. We'll run the game again. I love it when there's not very much going on because it compiles really quickly. Okay, so now if we push up and let go of the key, it'll stop moving. And similarly, if I push down, it'll stop moving. The character will still go off the screen because there's no boundaries, but at least when I push up, it goes up, and when I let go, it stops going up, and similarly with the down. Okay, already a lot better, and the speed seems to be less frantic as a result. So that's one bug sorted out. The second thing we want to sort out is a little bit more complicated, but not too difficult once you know how. So we'll close this. So what we need to do is we need to stop the dragon going off the screen as we move up and down so that it reaches the boundary limit and it stays within those boundaries. Now in order to do that, we're going to have to start looking at variables for the first time. These are very fundamental within GameMaker and we'll cover them more over the next couple of tutorials. But for this stage, what we'll do is we'll look at two of the most fundamental variables, and that is the X and Y axes. Now, what you may have learned at school, or what you may recall, is that the X-axis is your horizontal axis and your Y is your vertical axis. Now, when you work with those with graphs and things like that, you normally start in the bottom left-hand corner of the graph, and that's your 0, 0. But that's not quite how it works in GameMaker. Your 0, 0 point is the upper top left point of whatever you're looking at. So if we look at the room, for example, if we look up here, so this will be 0, 0. As you can see, my mouse cursor is here, and you can see the axes down here. So you can see that that's 0, 0, and if we were to come all the way to the bottom corner, we can see that that is the entire width and the entire height of the game, which is, if I can get it to work properly, your 640 by 480. So when we created our dragon, we didn't change the origin of our dragon. Now you'll see the origin down here, and this is the starting point of the XY axes for the sprite. At the moment it's set to 0, 0, and you can just see the crosshairs up here. If we were to center that, you'll see that the crosshairs move to the center of the sprite, which is 6775. That then essentially becomes your center point for the sprite. So that's the sprite's 0, 0. And then if you were to move it within the game, then you start from that origin point. Now it's quite a complicated concept, and if you've not come across it before, it can seem very confusing, but it will become more obvious as we work with it. But let's move on for now, and so we can try and get an idea of how it works in practice. So if we look at our object dragon, when we move up and down, we're moving obviously up and down the y-axis. Now we're not going to want it to move above the 0 point in the room of the y-axis, and we're not going to want it to move below the lowest point of the room, which is 480 in this particular room. So we need to prevent it from going out of those boundaries. Now remembering that the dragon is 150 high and that our origin is centered in the top left hand corner, in order for us to consider where the dragon is within our room, we need to be thinking about the 150 pixels that go along here and deducting that when we're looking at where it's placed within the y-axis of the room. sounds a bit like garble, so let's just do it, and then hopefully that will make it seem like it makes a bit more sense. So if we're moving up, we're not going to want the character to be able to move up if it's going up and above the room. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to look at the whether the y-axis position of the sprite is going to be going out and beyond the room. So we're not going to want it to move above the room. We're only going to want it to be able to move if y is greater than 0. If the y-axis of the sprite is above 0, in which case it'll be outside of the room, we're not going to want it to move any further. So we only want it to move if y is greater than 0. Now for consistency, I'm going to just put this in brackets. So just to explain what we've done here then. So what we've done is we've asked a question. We've asked if an expression is true, and if it is, what it will do is the following set of actions. Now, if you ask a question and it is true, or if you ask it to be false, if you're asking whether the expression is false and it's correct, then it will do the next action that's there. If you want it to do more than one action, then you need to put it into brackets, and it will therefore do the whole block of actions if that expression is true. So if we push the up button now, if we're out of the room, then we're going to be unable to move it in the direction of up. But also what we need to do is we need to make sure that if we're already moving, that we don't actually go off the screen then as well. So if we're already moving, then this is going to be bypassed, because this is only going to be called when we first press the up key. It's not going to continue to run this argument whilst we're already moving in that direction. So in order to get around that, what we're going to need is an end step event. Now an end step event will, at the end of every step, which is currently in our room is 30 times a second, these actions will be called. So we use an end step event because what we're going to look at is if at the end of our step, if our character has moved out of the room, we're going to want it to say, no, we don't want to be out of the room, move back to the edge of the room. Whereas if we were to use it in a step event or a begin step event, then the object may not have moved out of the room yet, and therefore it's going to create a juddering effect where on the following step it's going to move it back. But what we want to do is to prevent that juddering effect and have a look at the end of the step whether we need to make a correction on the object's location or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to ask a question at the end of every step. And the first thing we're going to have to ask is if y is less than 0. So if the y-axis of our object is less than 0, then we know that it's moved above the top of the room. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to move it back to the edge of the room by setting the variable y to 0. And obviously we're also going to want to set the speed to 0 as well to prevent it from moving. So what we are doing now is we're looking at the end of the step whether the object has moved out of the room. If it has, then we're going to move it back to the top of the room and we're going to set its speed to 0. Now similarly, we're going to want to do that for the bottom of the room as well. So again, we're going to ask at the end of every step what the y-axis is, and if the object's y-axis has exceeded what we want it to be, then we can set it to something that we do want it to be. So now we're going to want to test if it's above the edge of the room down the bottom. So we're going to say greater than 330. Now if you remember, the room is 480 pixels along the y-axis, but our sprite or our object is 150 pixels long, and our origin is right in the top left hand corner. So we need to deduct that from the room axis to make sure that it's called when the bottom of our object hits the bottom of the room and not when the top of our object hits the bottom of the room. So we say 480 minus 150 equals 330. So if the y-axis of our object is greater than 330, we want to do the following set of actions. Again, in a very similar way, we're going to want to set the variable of y, but this time obviously we want to set it to 330. so that it's at the bottom of the screen. And again, we're going to want to make sure that we don't have any more speed because we don't want any juddering effects, so we're going to set the speed to 0. Now we've already added the additional parameter that if we press in up, that we're not going to go off the screen if we're already off the screen. So we just need to do the same thing for the down. So again, we're just going to ask the question, the test, the expression. So if y is less than 330, then we are able to move. If it's not less than 330, then we're not able to move. Let's pop that up there and just pop the movement in brackets like that. So if y is less than 330, then we can move downwards. If it's not, then we're unable to even start to move downwards. Okay, so that should be it. So if we now test our game, hopefully this will work. Haven't made any errors in the code. And what we should have is our dragon is able to move to the top of the screen and to the bottom of the screen, but it can't move out of the screen. So we can go up, we can push the up button, but we can't go any further. Go down to the bottom, we can repeatedly try and push down, but it won't go out. So what we have is our dragon is now within the boundaries only, and it only moves up and down when we push the up and down buttons. And that's our character. Okay, so that's the end of this tutorial. What we'll do in part 3 is we'll create the enemy side of things and start to have some the ability to score some points and to fire some fireballs. If you do have any questions, then please do get in contact. You can ask in the comment section below the video, but obviously this video has been on for a little while. I might not be checking that all the time, so if you do want to get in contact with me directly, then please email me at contact@michael-bateman.com. Check out my website for all my other tutorial videos. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.